This is not going to be a big focus here on large movements of military forces, in my judgment. There will be military action. But the war here is going to be fought against the terrorist cells, and that means that we've got to use much greater intelligence.
Now, while there really is no talk about reinstating the draft right now up here on Capitol Hill, some of the other fronts they're working on all at once. One is allowing law enforcement to get new tools, new powers that maybe would have been balked to just 5 days ago on civil libertarian concerns, but new powers to try to increase security and to track down the terrorists that may still be in this country associated with the attacks. The Attorney General, John Ashcroft, has talked to all the congressional leadership today, I think with the exception of Tom Daschle and the chairman of the relevant committees, about new powers that he hopes Congress will grant him almost immediately when they return on Thursday. Powers that include greater efforts, greater ability to do wiretapping with a single court order, possibly some immigration steps. Congress is working, both parties. There are concerns about civil liberties, but as Congressman Dick Gephardt said today, we are looking at a situation where we're going to have to talk about rebalancing the balance between freedom and security. Also, Wolf, one other thing I want to tell you about is John Kerry is also talking about allowing the military to come in to take over airport security. So a lot of proposals on many different tracks right now up here on Capitol Hill.
And what are you hearing about that legislation to provide some additional billions in financial assistance to the ailing airline industry?
Well, that is something that is very much on the fast track here. The specifics of it are $2.5 billion in immediate cash payments to the airline industry, another $12.5 billion in loan guarantees. There's some debate on it. It hasn't gone through yet, but that is one thing that the congressional leaders are working on. There is consensus that something needs to be done to bail out the airline industry. But, Wolf, leaders are pointing out it's not the only industry that may need immediate help up here. They're talking about the insurance industry, even the tourist industry, and also various other places that are affected because the whole economy, they believe, will be affected about this. So look for Congress when they return on Thursday to talk not just about the airline industry, but a comprehensive plan to stimulate the economy.
Jonathan Karl on Capitol Hill, thank you very much. Joey?
Just think about it, Wolf. The last draft cards were issued even a few years before the last members of Gen X were even born. Perhaps, but then again, maybe not, they can remember the Gulf War. Any other war is just from the history books to them. And as usual, with the gap between generations, many older Americans are now questioning the mettle of the nation's youth. CNN's Jason Bellini looks into youthful patriotism.
For a generation accustomed to fleeting fashion statements, for the moment, it's hip to be wearing the flag.
We drove in and we were saying we've never even done this on the 4th of July, like get dressed up.
Young people are flocking to nightly vigils around New York City, expressing a mix of emotions, including one that many from the X and Y generations have never felt before: patriotism, pride in being American, pride in their government.
I know in my particular case I've had a lot of issues with the U.S. government in the past. I mean, I'm gay, and they don't do a very good job, I think, of, supporting and including their gay citizens. And this is the first time I've really been able to look at the government in an, important situation and say they're doing a great job, and I'm glad to have them.
Older Americans have long wondered, do these kids have it in them? The love of country, the willingness to sacrifice. Having grown up in safe and privileged times, the under 30 crowd admits they've never been tested.
As a generation, we don't really have anything that brings us together because there hasn't been one world event that would do it for us.
Older Americans also have wondered whether their MTV generation compatriots know how to be serious, to not be cynical. Do young people care about anything other than that which directly affects them? MTV apparently thinks so. It switched to network news coverage the day of the disaster.
This is really unprecedented television.
TRL, the popular video countdown program with host Carson Daly, for the first time in its history, played not a single video.
Let's celebrate the gift of life.
You hear a lot of kids, all like, oh, the government sucks and blah, blah. But right now, I'm very proud to be, a voting member of our United States government.
Will the ADD generation lose interest quickly? MTV News reporter John Norris thinks not.
The idea of sacrifice, the idea of a threatening world is it's foreign to them. And I'm afraid that we may be on the brink of a real fundamental change in the kind of world we live in.
No, pretty much like the ways of America and like people around here and just America itself. Today, there was no reason not to be proud of the whole thing because of how people reacted to it,
For the younger generation, patriotism stoked not necessarily by tragedy itself, but by the way Americans react when the time comes. Jason Bellini, CNN, New York.
Gen X, Gen Y, the younger generation, and the huge responsibility which may in fact lie in their hands. More on that now from senior analyst Jeff Greenfield. Jeff, tell us about it. Do they have what it takes?
Well, yeah, and I think you get misled if the question is whether or not MTV is playing videos or not. I was reminded last night in an extended conversation we had on CNN about this by our younger guest that the firefighters who rushed into the World Trade Center, many of whom never made it out, the police who rushed in, many of whom never made it out, the rescue workers down at that site now going through hell to try to find some semblance of perhaps a survivor. These are all young people. These are not middle-aged people. They're people in their 20s and 30s. So right away we can answer one question that certainly a major part of this generation has what it takes. They've been proving it for years by doing the jobs that don't get celebrated as much on television. I think the harder question is really not so much whether the younger generation has it in it, but whether our leadership has it in our leaders to rally the country around, not in these first horrible moments and days, but when the going really gets tough, either militarily or through the kinds of changes in our country that will make it a harder, less comfortable place to live in.
Well, yeah, Jeff, I think that perhaps maybe youthful optimism, youthful idealism might be enough to motivate young people, but I guess now as a parent, I wonder if parents of this nation will have the guts to say, sure, let my kid go and do the hard work that might lie ahead here.
That, I think, Joy, is an extremely important question because, particularly hard as it is for us older Americans to recognize this, it is the parents of this generation who lived through the 60s, who rebelled in at least in substantial numbers against the government. Also, many members of my generation were in that war, and it was a class division. But the fact of the matter is that it is the people who grew up in the 60s who express as if it feels good, do it. We really don't owe obligations to anything beyond ourselves except to our own political beliefs. It really is an interesting question of what that generation has taught their children and whether their children, in fact, will say, well, it's different now, Mom and Dad. This country's under attack. We are not divided. This is not a political debate. This is a matter of national survival, and we're going to be part of it, whether it means going into the military or whether it simply means tightening belts in a way we never thought this generation was going to have to do.
It also has to do with expectations. I mean, after all, we think to Vietnam as the first war where we actually saw pictures from the battlefield. In the time since, we can now see live pictures from a battlefield. That will surely change perceptions. And the other thing that comes to my mind is that we have such a different perception of military hardware and technology. When people say to me, well, we can bomb the you-know-what out of them, it's because they think planes will come by, bombs will drop, but they're not thinking so much about ground forces.
Look, the part of this is something that I'm certainly no expert about. You just heard a guest who does know something about it assert, as most have, that we're not talking about drafting hundreds of thousands of young Americans to hit the beaches somewhere because there is no there as far as we can tell. I'll tell you something, though. It will be a more interesting question if militarily people decide whether in Afghanistan or whether in other states that harbor terrorists, it will require a protracted ground war. That changes the stakes incredibly. But I think the other part of this question that again is not the responsibility of the younger generation but its forebears is the degree to which the whole idea of confidence in leadership and trust in government has been undermined, eaten away over the last few decades, both by the conduct of our political leaders and by the adversarial, if not contemptuous, approach both of the news media, the late-night comedians, the popular culture at large, the, quote, post-ironic culture in which you never take anybody seriously, in which you mock leaders for their flaws. And a really interesting question to me is how are we going to get our heads around the idea that now it may be necessary to follow leaders that we've been taught over the years not to respect at all. That's a tricky one.
Our senior analyst, the thoughts of Jeff Greenfield with us tonight from New York. In the streets below Jeff Greenfield in New York City this evening, you've started to hear some of the rush of New York City life come back into place. As well, we know that the nation's trading system is to reopen tomorrow on the stock exchange. And over New York tonight, at this hour, you're seeing it, the Empire State Building, the tallest building now in the city of New York, lit up in patriotic red, white, and blue in memory of those lives that were lost in the course of this terrible series of attacks, and with an eye to what is ahead, building strength for the nation. Wolf.
Joey, more fallout today in the world of sports. The golf competition known as the Ryder Cup has been postponed for a year. The United States team informed the team from Europe it will not make the trip to England next week as originally planned. As you probably know by now, the National Football League took the day off today as well. CNN's Tom Rinaldi reports on absence of Sunday heroes.
If we wanted escape, instead, we need endurance. If we hoped for relief, now we show resolve. If we wished for celebration, we find silence. The American Sunday is defined by different kinds of worship. For decades, the end zone seats and the upper deck bleachers have formed the pews in the second church of the day. We understand that these are just players, that this is just a game. Yet the game grants escape and relief and celebration through our autumn Sundays. Not this Sunday. By any measure, the NFL is the most popular league in America. No, it doesn't have baseball's history. It can't boast basketball's global flair. Yet here, it seems to eclipse both with a concentrated passion. For many, it separates a single day of the week, and the weeks mark a separate season of the year. But we've witnessed a week unique in all years, separate perhaps for all time. So it is not a team that grants us a common spirit and a fervent bind this day. It is a week in time that grants us these things. When President Kennedy was assassinated in 1963 on a Dallas Friday afternoon, just 2 days later, the NFL played. When America was at war in 1991, the Super Bowl was played. But this is not an assassination. This is not a battle abroad. This is home. These are heroes in different uniforms. Usually, there are two teams. They share one game, our game. But this day, the game rests in the shadow of one country, our country.
We check the latest developments now.